Jordan, you have
I
made
made it. Yeah, my local network, I'm working from home today, and my local network just went out for 3 hours, they tell me. So I'm glad I could make it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your effort to join us. So everybody, we have started the recordings, and since we will do a transcription of this meeting, I will kindly ask when you speak, just try to be as clear as possible, so we have the more correct transcription of the meeting. Okay, so greetings everyone. My name is Sasha Horvat. I'm philosopher and theologian from Rijeka, and this workshop that we are joining today is part of the project titled Philosophy of Neuroscience and Theology, Understanding Data, Methods and Results of Neuroscience of Religion. It's led by yours truly and funded by SET Foundations and John Templeton Foundations. So this event is co-organized by the Faculty of Medicine and the Faculty of Health Studies at the University of Rijeka and by Nicolaus Copernicus University and their Hub of ECLAS project. So basically the idea was that we had a really great conference in Rijeka in November 2024. Many of you participated in this conference. And after this conference, we also published a book, Neuroscience of Religion, Integrating Brain, Mind, and Beliefs with Springer last year. And the conclusion was that we basically need more direct and focused discussion on the topic of neuroscience of religion. So, because in many emerging interdisciplinary fields, it seems that the key challenges often become more clear through direct dialogue between experts. So this workshop is basically an attempt of direct discussion. So this is kind of a dialogical alternative to traditional conferences. So today we have philosophers, we have theologians, we have psychologists, we have neurologists, neuroscientists, and all of us will try somehow to reflect on neuroscientific data on human religiosity and how to understand it, how to interpret it, and other issues. So one of the central questions of the project was, can theologians use the philosophy of neuroscience to better understand the assumptions, methods, and interpretations behind neuroscience of religion? So basically, I do hope that we will be able to touch certain issues like cognitive models of religious experience, methodological limits of neuroscience of religion, and some broader challenges of connecting neuroscientific findings with philosophical and theological perspectives, especially anthropology. So this session, as I already mentioned, will be recorded. We will publish it as soon as possible on YouTube. And there is a possibility that a publication will follow based on our discussions here today. So we can talk about that a little bit later or later on via emails. So before we start, let me just briefly tell you the format of this workshop. So each speaker, we have 6 speakers today: Piotr Roszak, Lluis Oviedo, Robert Kuhn, Visala, Jordan Grafman, and Alex Gomez-Marin. And all of you will have approximately 3 minutes, top 3 minutes, to present your conceptual notes. So these notes, for those of you who are not speakers or interveners, have been circularized among speakers. So everybody had a chance to read the notes of the other speakers. And so that's why you will have only 3 minutes. So please just be punctual. So let's have something different that is not a conference, but a discussion. So after all of the 6 speakers present their conceptual notes, then we will open the floor for the interveners with their questions. So the interveners, Hans van Eyghen, Hans Ferdinand Angel, Justin Barrett, and Gudehard Bruntrup, have sent their questions before this meeting, and the speakers were able to read the questions and prepare to answer them. So Hans, I haven't received your questions, but we will as we go along, you will be able to present also your questions. So if anybody would like to join the discussion, please raise your hand. So that's the first thing. Priority in discussions will go firstly to address speaker, then to the intervener, and then to the others. So if there is a question posed to person A, you can also join answering that same question if you feel that you have something to contribute to. With hoping that all things being clear and that we can proceed with this workshop, we will go by the list that was on our poster. So, Piotr, are you here?
Okay. Yes, I'm here. Hello, thank you, Sasha.
Yeah. Fantastic. So the whole 3 minutes is completely yours.
Thank you very much. But first of all, thank you, Sasha, for organizing this workshop. I'm very much looking forward to learning from all the speakers and participants. So let me briefly summarize the main points of my paper, especially for those joining us this afternoon without access to our concept note. My contribution addresses a central question at the intersection of neuroscience and theological anthropology. How should we interpret neuroscientific findings within a theological account of the human person? We know that neuroscience today offers remarkable precision in describing human cognition, emotion, and even religious experience. However, my key claim is this: empirical data alone cannot resolve theological questions about the nature of human person. Alone here, I think, is crucial. Many apparent conflicts between neuroscience and theology do not arise from the data themselves, but from the interpretative assumptions, especially the tendency to reduce human experience to neural processes. And to respond to this, I propose what I called in my concept note a model of cognitive security. This is a kind of approach that integrates neuroscientific data while clearly recognizing their epistemic limits. Why is this necessary? Because today we face not only an excess of data, but also risks such as overinterpretation, cognitive overload, and even distortions introduced by AI systems. And without stable interpretative frameworks, these factors can lead to confusion rather than to knowledge. So a central methodological problem here concerns, in my opinion, the relationship between causation versus correlation. Neuroscience often identifies patterns of brain activation and presents them as explanations of experience, for example, in studies of meditation or prayer. But what we must ask, are these neural processes causing the experience, or are they conditions that accompany it? This distinction is crucial, I think. In fact, it parallels a classical issue, for instance, in Christian biblical exegesis. So the difference and relation between the literal sense of Scripture and spiritual sense of Scripture. Knowing how something happens does not yet explain what it means. And from Thomistic perspective, human beings are a hylomorphic unity, a unity of form and matter. The brain is therefore not the source of personhood, but a substrate that enables human action. Neural processes can be understood as what we might call a dispositional cause. They make action possible, but they do not determine it. And based on this, I proposed 3 methodological cautions. First, we must distinguish description from explanation. Neuroscience describes patterns. It does not by itself explain the metaphysical nature of the human person. Second, we must recognize layer causality. Neural processes are necessary but not sufficient for understanding cognition, freedom, or moral agency. It's like a matter in this metaphysical scheme. And third, we must avoid reductionism, especially the tendency to assign normative or moral significance directly to neural states. And building on these principles, I outline a practical protocol for theologian in which we could begin with clearly identifying the empirical data that we are receiving from research. Then we can assess their scope, limits, what exactly is being measured, Next, we interpret these findings as metaphysically accidents or manifestation, not as defining the essence of the person. And finally, we formulate a conclusion that are both empirically informed and theologically grounded, while remaining aware of its limits. So let me conclude with this main point. Neuroscience provides indispensable descriptive insights, but only a higher order interpretative framework can address questions about human essence, freedom, moral agency. What I propose, therefore, is an integration, one that combines epistemic humility with methodological rigor and safeguards what theology ultimately seeks to understand, the truth about the human person in all its dimensions, from top-down and bottom-up perspective. So briefly, this was my point. Thank you, Sasha.
Thank you, Piotr, for keeping track of 3 minutes and for letting us know your basic position. So, and also for co-organizing this event as ECLAS Hub. So the next one is Lluis. Lluis, please, your 3 minutes to present your conceptual note.
Yeah, I'm very grateful too for the opportunity to participate in this workshop and this seminar. And yeah, my point, as you could read in my former contribution, is that yeah, the question is, what can learn theology from all this process, all this research in neuroscience? I remember meeting some neuroscientists 16 years ago in the Karolinska Institute and telling me that I would leave without job or jobless after 15 years because neuroscientists would complete the connectome, and at this point they would be able to go to get insight to every mental activity comprised religious experience or religious beliefs. And at this point, we would no longer need theology or anything of philosophy of religion, because neuroscience could solve or could reveal everything. Obviously, this kind of reductionist position is out of touch with reality and is beyond any or is a too wild expectation to pay attention to it. Anyway, the question remains for theologians: what can we learn from neuroscientific developments? Whether after the great expectations with Tilburg, Aquili, and others, we gain any valuable insight. My conclusion is that we could get very little because perhaps we were not able to put the right questions to this research. And without putting the right questions, so what theologians are looking for when we are meeting or having to deal with neuroscientific developments, especially these studies about the religious mind and so on, but not only. So without addressing the right questions, hardly we can gain any knowledge on this. So I'm not sure I share completely Piotr's approach about the relationship between empirical knowledge, empirical data, and theological knowledge. Yeah, that's still for me a point, but we can go back during the discussion on this. But the point for me is that perhaps we could put better questions to neuroscientists, so that theology could play a more active role in setting the agenda of neuroscience. And in this case, we could ask, for instance, to what extent studies on plasticity of brain and neural networks could help to better understand the possibility of conversion, the effects of grace as a transformative influence, to what extent this structure or architecture of the brain could reflect better several of Christian high points or tenets, important tenets, like the need to understand our identity as related to God. So, to what extent the architecture of the brain allows for this kind of relationship, or enriches, or offers a clearer model or standard. And so there are other questions, again, like about the human frailty, or the sinfulness or negativity, so on and so on. That could be interesting if we are allowed to go into the research, the ongoing research, with the right questions, because other developments of artificial intelligence, perhaps they are not relevant for us. Yes, for me, is enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Lluis. Thank you for your perspective on the issue and what can theologians do to become more active. This is really important topic that we should discuss later on. And now I would kindly ask Robert to give us an overview of his approach to the topic. We cannot hear you, Robert.
Your microphone's off.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, Sasha, thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to meet a lot of new friends, and I see one very good old friend, Justin. It's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time, so great to interact together. Let me give you a little bit of my background because it reflects on my concept note and my orientation. My doctorate was in neuroscience, the neurophysiology of the cerebral cortex. I was very interested in consciousness. Of course, the research program that I did had very little to do with consciousness, but it gave me a very good understanding of the scientific approach to human mentality. And for the last more than 25 years, I've been producing and hosting Closer to Truth, which some of you may know, which is a U.S. public television, PBS television show since the year 2000, so 26th year. And in the last 10 years, and particularly since the pandemic, the very prominent on the web. And through this, and in Closer to Truth, I've interviewed, and when I say interviewed, these are 3 to 4 hour discussions with some of the leading thinkers in 3 core categories. The first is cosmos, which deals with cosmology, physics, mathematics, philosophy of science. Second is mind, consciousness, personal identity, free will, alien intelligence, artificial intelligence. And the third we call meaning, which is basically philosophy of religion and philosophical theology. We've recently added a 4th category, life, which is philosophy of biology. And so in each of these categories, I've had the opportunity to talk to over 550, I think now, of the world's leading thinkers in these categories. And my particular orientation the primary one has always been the nature of consciousness. And the first observation I want to make is that when you look at the world and you see this intellectual landscape of cosmos, consciousness, meaning, which embeds the religion and theology, I see from this perspective very strong silos that in each particular one, when you're in that environment, it's everyone has the same orientation. It's a natural human tendency. And you see that and each group knows that they're the other groups, but they really feel that their group has the primary understanding. And whether it's a neuroscience approach and a reductionist or idealism or from a theological standpoint, the Abrahamic religions in which we deal with it, we've focused on Christian philosophy because that's where much of the great philosophy has been done recently, but also Islamic and Jewish. And in the last 5 years have made an effort to engage Eastern religions, Hindu, Buddhist, and Chinese religion and some minor religions as well, to get a broad perspective. So my first observation is that there are all of these silos that have very specific orientations to the big questions. And the question we're asking in terms of the relationship between neuroscience and theology is a very interesting and very important one. But my primary claim, open to a well-meaning attack from all of you, is that a primary first criterion of assumption must be your theory of consciousness, because each of these groups, whether they know it or not, have a theory of consciousness that they are assuming to be the actual case. And what my claim is that your theory of consciousness is not another theory among others, but it is the foundational theory by which you judge all others. So the questions we're asking in terms of the neuroscience of religion and the implications and the difference between correlation and causation and how it all works is based on your theory of consciousness, how you approach that question. And I will be vigorous in defending that position. In the last 3 years, 2.5 years, I have done several works on consciousness called The Landscape of Consciousness, which was first published in the summer of 2024, so a little less than 2 years ago, in the surprising journal called the Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology. And I'll just tell you an incident from that. When they asked me to do it, I didn't volunteer. I would have been crazy with all the work I had to do. But when I was kind of coerced into doing it, and it was supposed to be an introduction to an issue on quantum consciousness, I kind of rejected it and didn't want to do it. And then finally, I realized that if I'm going to do this, I need to do it properly. And so when I submitted my first draft, the peer reviewer, who was unknown, who gave me some very good advice, said that, the neuroscience you have and the computational work, even some of the quantum work, is really good, and we want to publish it full speed ahead. But the stuff you have on philosophy and panpsychism and all the theology, and I dealt with each of the major religious groups, perhaps not completely at the time, but I had all the religious groups, including folk religion, approach the conscious. They said, that the readers of Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology not interested in any of that, and so take that out, it'll be a better paper. And I said, if I were in your place to the reviewer, I would reject the paper on that basis for this journal. But I'm going to do this once in my life, and I have to do this the way I think is proper. And my goal is to represent the entirety of humanity's thinking about consciousness, and all of those sections have to be included. To their credit, they had no cuts, and all of it was included. And this has subsequently grown in 3 or 4 other papers, and a major website, Alex Gomez-Marin, who's with me here, joined me in this effort and has done some terrific contributions to it. And so that's my primary claim, that a substantive foundational question is, what is your theory of consciousness? Later on, I can describe the different categories or whatever else we want. And I also want to address later the question of epistemic and explanatory pluralism and how those articulate. That was an excellent question that was submitted. Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much for your perspective. I'm truly looking forward to see how we'll handle another layer of complexity to understanding neuroscience of religion with notion of consciousness. Aku, please. Your 3 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you. So those who do not know me, I'm Aku Visala. I'm from the University of Helsinki. And I'm so happy to see so many faces of friends in the crowd, and also potential new friends. So happy to be here. And I'm especially humbled following Robert, because I'm a big fan of Closer to Truth show, and I've been a big fan for more than 20 years now. And in my books, to be interviewed for Closer to Truth means that you've made it in my field. So I always look at it from that point of view. Wink, wink.
We'll set a date.
In any case, yes. So how lovely to see you all. So basically, my few comments come. So my background is a kind of twin background. So With Justin and with many others, I've worked on the cognitive science of religion for quite some time. And then on the other hand, for the last 10 years, I've been doing a lot of work on the free will and moral responsibility domain. And in the paper that I sent with the comments and ideas, I basically wanted to highlight two things that arise, especially from the free will discussion, but also at the same time from my work on the cognitive science of religion. And the first point that I wanted to make was about the role of models. And this is a kind of philosophy of science point. So what is it that neuroscience produces, or what is it that science produces? And one answer to this is a model. And a model is a kind of mini picture of things that are relevant to the question being asked. So the kind of fundamental idea behind explanatory pluralism that I want to endorse here is the idea that every model is an answer to a specific kind of question. And it only answers to the model only takes into account those factors that are relevant for the answering of the question. And that's the reason why we need to focus and attend very carefully at the questions that we are the questions that are driving the research. And this is something that is not often done especially when trying to understand and trying to apply neuroscientific theories or interpret them in some other context. So we often lose sight of what those theories are actually doing and what they are not doing. So this idea of explanatory pluralism, I think, is quite important, and there are many good questions about that, so we can come back to that. But the other thing that I want to highlight is also the notion of basic concepts, especially how those concepts are operationalized. And oftentimes, when we are looking at neuroscientific research or research that is supposed to be leading into some philosophically substantive conclusion, it usually turns out that the concepts that are being used and the concepts that are operationalized, there's something going on there that we need to carefully attend to. And this is especially the case with the free will debate. So there's been so much stuff done on neuroscience of free will and various other things that are relevant here. But at the same time, it's the concept itself is not very well defined usually in these studies, or it's the case that it's been defined or operationalized in ways that's not in line with the other parts of the debate. And I guess the same thing is here with religion too. So religion is even more difficult concept than something like free will, because we have so many different ideas of what religion is and so on. So drawing conclusions and operationalizing the concept is going to be extremely difficult, but extremely crucial if we want to say that those models actually address the questions that, let's say, philosophers or theologians are asking. So in that sense, I think we have to attend very carefully to these two aspects. So the nature of the models themselves and the concepts and how they're operationalized in different domains. And it seems to me that the way that models are constructed and the ways that concepts are operationalized in different domains is very, very context sensitive. So when we pick up a theory from neuroscience and say, we've got these concepts here and we've got this model there, then we can interpret it in a philosophical setting. Usually something is left out. Something usually happens and things go missing. So these are the kinds of points of attention that I want to draw people's attention to. Thank you.
Thank you, Aku. Looking forward to see what are the benefits and negatives of models in science and in neuroscience of religion. Our next guest is Jordan. Jordan, please, you have the floor for 3 minutes. Thank you. We cannot hear you. No worries.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it. Sorry you couldn't hear me. My interest throughout my career has been in better understanding the functions of the human prefrontal cortex. There are obvious reasons to want to understand it. Many people believe that area of the brain is an area that makes us uniquely different from other species. I am, by the way, a cognitive neuroscientist, not a neurologist. That was suggested in one of the questions, but I just wanted to clear. I'm a PhD, not an MD. For a long time, I've been quite interested in using convergent techniques. We use functional neuroimaging, but we also do a lot of what we call lesion mapping, looking at various kinds of patient groups. And we do normal studies without any neuroscience technique associated with it to better understand the functions of the human prefrontal cortex. Now, I've more recently become, one of the areas I study is beliefs. And this can be political beliefs, economic beliefs, and more recently, religious beliefs. It's obvious why anybody would want to study that. It's critical to social development, critical to establishing morals and ethics. It contributes to societal glue that can, particularly across national boundaries. So it's not limited to a particular nation. We can also study it because religious beliefs are the grounds for justifying various behaviors. And there are data sets available, or data that can be easily accumulated to study religious beliefs. So we've been interested in what brain regions and networks accommodate the representation of religious beliefs. We want to understand better in the brain whether other beliefs share this representational space in the brain. For example, if you're atheist, do you share some of the same networks? Do political, economic, and moral beliefs overlap with any brain network that seems to be associated with religious beliefs? And how do these networks interact with other networks? For example, those concerned with, say, positive, like empathy, or negative, like outgroup judgments that have to do with emotion. And we're interested in how religious beliefs might prime other belief systems. And I'm also quite interested in transitional beliefs. So where somebody starts out having a deep religious belief and they transition to being agnostic or atheist, and vice versa. And that clearly involves plasticity in the brain if people change those beliefs. So we're quite interested in doing that. By taking, I think this approach contributes and complements other approaches. It is not a reductionist approach, as I heard before, nor could it be. So it's complementary in that sense. And I think on the basis of a lot of the work we've done to date and continue to do, we're slowly but surely focusing. And within religion, I've become very interested in how miracles are represented and the importance of supernatural agents in representing miracles. And regardless of how these things are enacted in society and in real life, they have to have a representation in the brain. And I'm interested in those kinds of neural networks and how such beliefs, and presumably there are many, many beliefs, just like we have many objects or many words represented in the brain. And the internal structure of those networks turn out to be, I think, quite interesting potentially and quite important. And that's how you get relationships between religious belief and other beliefs and cognitive representations in the brain. So I'll stop there, but that's sort of my approach. And I did contribute. We had some of you might have seen the article we had, the opinion piece we had in Nature a couple of years ago now. And the point was to try to recruit. It was a recruitment poster, basically, to try to get other neuroscientists involved in this, because despite the obvious importance of religion and religious belief, it's been relatively neglected outside of studying meditative experiences, states. But the actual cognitive aspects have been relatively neglected by neuroscientists. There are obviously people doing it, but much less in numbers than people who study, for example, interpersonal relationships, et cetera. So we think it's an important area to study, and I love it. So I'm not gonna stop doing it. That's for sure. Thank you for having me join the conversation.
Thank you, Jordan, for your experience, for sharing your experience, and we are looking forward to hear. Did you get any feedback after the piece in Nature?
And Jordan, if you lower your camera a little bit, then we can see more of you. We only see that not much better.
But I got to hold it up. So I was trying to give my arms a rest a little bit. But here I am. How you guys?
Yeah, great to see you. Alex, please, your 3 minutes to present your position on neuroscience of religion.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here amongst you. I subscribe virtually everything said. I'm going to bring some more topics, I suppose, on the table. A little bit about my biography, at least professionally. I'm a theoretical physicist by training, so I know what it is like to be a physicist and to believe that on a whiteboard you shall capture all the secrets of the universe. Then I moved into neurobiology and I studied fruit flies, worms, and mice for nearly 2 decades, maybe a bit less, which are the Lux model organisms. And on a third stage, I discovered that the best model organism to understand the human mind, which is the promise of neuroscience, is actually the human being. So I started trying to investigate human behavior, cognition, and then consciousness. And then on a fourth unexpected turn of events, I almost died 5 years ago. I had a near-death experience. I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. There were 3 figures waiting for me. I was at peace, and one of them was Jesus Christ, and I'm not a religious man. So that was very striking. And since then, I went even further to understand what I call the edges of consciousness. Now, what I want to bring on the table today is the subtlety and the danger of the word "of," because when we write the neuroscience of religion, it sounds to me like what my peers try to do with the neuroscience of consciousness, which typically it's to explain it, or even better for them to explain it away. So I want to talk to you about being an insider, because I'm a neuroscientist working on consciousness, but also an outsider, and you'll see why in a minute. Talk to you about the dangers of subscribing to the orthodoxy, to the status quo, to the consensus knowledge that you may receive from the sciences, being a theologian or a philosopher. So this tendency of, well, there's religion and this has to do with consciousness, so maybe we can really reduce religion to consciousness, and consciousness is produced by the brain, which is the central dogma of neuroscience. Consciousness produced by the brain, therefore, when and if we understand the brain, all the rest will follow. Now, I wanted to only mention 3 important problems that we can unfold. One is the blind spot problem of consciousness. Consciousness is the condition of possibility to do science, and it's what allows us to even make measurements and construct objectivity. And yet we, when I say we, it's science for the last 400 years pretends we can explain it away. That's due to Galileo's room divided or folding screen. I call it like that, where he said, paraphrasing here, human soul for religion will deal with that, would lend itself to measurement and mathematization, and then physics and chemistry and biology and so on was a great success. So the blind spot problem is a big one. This view from nowhere, this even God's eye view, when consciousness is primarily first person. The second problem is what I call the toothbrush problem, beautifully illustrated by Robert's Landscape of Consciousness. We have 365 and counting theories of consciousness. Theories of consciousness are like toothbrushes. Everybody has their own now, and nobody wants to use one another. So now we have this wild pluralism that, as Robert was saying, it's not only wild, but it's kind of siloed. So we have too many after having nothing and then just too little, when in the 90s, materialism was the only game in town to do consciousness. And the third problem is the adversarial problem. 2 of those very neurobiological theories of consciousness were recently tested throughout an adversarial collaboration that spent millions of dollars from the Templeton Foundation. It took 8 years. They had 3 teams, team A, team B, and neutral team. They went and tested 2 of them, integrated information theory and global neuronal workspace, and it was a successful failure because they couldn't rule them out, and both proponents just changed their predictions post hoc. So after the experiments were done, everybody gained 20 IQ points, and they now understood why their predictions should. So this tells us we have blind spot problem, too many theories, although I enjoy the pluralism, and also we cannot even test two of them. So let me tell you two more things. Scientists, we are profoundly indifferent and profoundly ignorant about philosophy, let alone theology. Actually, we think, I don't, but I'm just trying to represent the consensus here for a moment. We think it's completely irrelevant. Why? Because we have this series of isms that I'm only going to name, and my proposal to you is, if the humanities, philosophy, and theology give up on them and mirror the sciences, we're lost. So what are they? Materialism, reductionism, and mechanicism. This is the first triad. Another triad is skepticism in the form of dogmatic skepticism, positivism, and atheism/secularism, which seems to be like a package you must buy and use if you want to be a neuroscientist. And then a third triad is literalism. These things are either fact or fiction, explicationism, like everything needs to be explained, and finally scientism. So we need to be very aware of all these 9. Finally, because I don't want to eat a lot of time, when one has an NDE, as it happened to me, the consensus explanation is hallucination. Move on. If one has a psychedelic trip, it's like, well, recreational. If one speaks about grace, it's wishful thinking. If one has a mystical experience, perhaps it's epilepsy. So I don't think that's fair. And I think science should not become the new religion, nor technology with transhumanism, which is another big topic today. And so I beg for your help from the humanities and from philosophy and theology. Don't let us scientists carry on this path, because I would say, despite our great success and expertise and tools, I don't think we know what we're doing. And now it's urgent with AI. It's urgent with AI because also AI are posing, and technology, it's becoming a pseudo-religion dressed in technoscientific knowledge. So I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much. It's such a rare opportunity to hear that theologians and philosophers are needed in science. So thank you for the overview. Thank you to all the speakers. And just shortly, my take in neuroscience of religion is from phenomenological perspective of religious experiences, given that they are so deeply subjective, embodied, embedded, shaped by personal, social, and environmental contexts. I wonder just how big the difference is between laboratory settings and everyday life experiences. So this is something that I will try also to push during the discussions. Okay, so now it's time for our interveners. And given that Godehard is in a, we can say, war zone and could be leaving any minute, I would like first to give the word to Godehard, and for his questions, he raised something that he calls the pluralism problem from many of the speakers' conceptual notes. And please, Godehard, address and ask the first question to whomever you like.
Okay, thank you. My name is Godehard Brüntrup. I'm a philosopher and a theologian, and I might best be described. I introduced the idea of panpsychism in the German discussion about the same time, even a little earlier than David Chalmers in the early 1990s. And I was also instrumental in running the analytic theology project by Templeton, the European branch of it. So I'm interested in panpsychism, idealism, analytic philosophy, and I also had a near-death experience and did some research on near-death experiences. So that's quickly the background. I did see a common denominator, so to speak, in many of the talks, and this is the question of pluralism, how pluralism is let me see, I'll just try to find the file. Sorry, maybe easier maybe to read it from the file, because then it will be quicker. So my idea was that there is a common denominator, the idea of pluralism, and each contributor rejects crude reductionism, and each confirms that neuroscience cannot by itself settle theological questions. And each one of them proposes some version of a pluralist framework. Yet the pluralisms differ quite substantially. And so I asked two questions, actually, one for Visala, and we work together in the Templeton project, so we know each other well, and one for Kuhn, and I would like to ask them together. So here's the question for Visala. How does your explanatory pluralism handle genuine intermodal conflict as opposed to mere complementarity? So the Libet case you talk about is a case in question here. A folk psychological model treats conscious intentions as causally before, that is, upstream of action. And Libet's neuroscientific model locates motor preparation before reportable conscious intention. So here the two models make competing claims about the causal ordering of the same event sequence. And you write that pluralism seeks to explore how different models are related without the need to provide a unified, complete account. But when exploration reveals contradiction rather than complementarity, pluralism needs an account of this, of adjudication. Without one, the position deflates reductionism effectively, but lacks the resources to engage with cases where neuroscience poses a genuine rather than merely apparent challenge to higher level frameworks. So this is the case when there's no complementarity, but a real conflicting explanations. And connected with this, the question to Robert Kuhn, how do you distinguish your epistemic pluralism from Visala's explanatory pluralism? And does the priority you assign to consciousness and consciousness theories reintroduce a new form of explanatory privilege? If all neuroscientific findings about religion must first be filtered through a theory of consciousness before they can be properly interpreted, then consciousness theory functions not as one voice in a pluralist conversation, but as the gatekeeper that sets the terms for all the subsequent interpretations. That looks less like pluralism and more like a new foundationalism, entered not on neuroscience, but on the metaphysics of consciousness. So that's the new foundation, the metaphysics of consciousness. If you can show that foregrounding consciousness theory or metaphysics of consciousness is compatible with general pluralism, perhaps by arguing that making this dependence explicit is the condition of intellectual honesty rather than a form of privilege, then your framework and Visala's would complement each other. But it seems that your dependence claim is so strong, and your language suggests this, then that you owe us an account why this particular order of priority, so metaphysics of consciousness first, does not violate the very pluralism you want to embrace. That's my two questions.
Thank you, Godehard. So before Aku and Robert start answering these tough questions, I just remind you that all of you can join the discussion. Just please raise your hand so we have some kind of order. So please, Aku and Robert.
Thank you, Gode. Those are great questions. This allows me to expand a little bit on the issue of explanatory pluralism. So the idea is to attend to the questions that the models are supposed to answer. So when we are looking at these different models that we are comparing, perhaps, or trying to look at, looking at these models, it's clear that there can be conflict between models. And the Libet case is a good case in the sense that there at least seems to be a conflict. So there's a folk psychological model, and then there's a neuroscientific model. And they seem to be in conflict. Well, the question is whether they actually are in conflict. So what are the conditions for conflict between the models? So we have to attend very carefully what the models are about and how the concepts are operationalized in the models themselves. So basically, pluralism, at least for me, is not an attempt to deny the possibility of conflict. It's just the fact that we direct our attention to the specifics of the models and not derive conclusions from the models too easily from jumping to one from one to another. And it seems to me that in the Libet case, for instance, it seems that the folk view and the Libet view are quite different when you start to look at the details and how the concepts are defined and operationalized. And it might be even that there is a conflict, and that conflict has to be somehow well, it has to be solved in one way, perhaps, or another, if there is really a conflict. And then you have to run these models against each other, and then just to do the same thing that we do in science very often. So we look at the evidence, and we look at the simpleness of the explanation, or the completeness, and so on and so on. So conflict is not something that's somehow ruled out. But the question for me always is whether the conflict is actually there. And oftentimes it's not there when we start to look at the details. And because we're operating at different levels of, let's say, analytic description. So oftentimes folk psychological views explain different things than the neuroscientific models of some specific mechanism, because the models are so different from one another, and they explain so many different things, and they answer different kinds of questions. It seems that the conflict is actually quite difficult to generate, and oftentimes the conflict is not really there, even though it looks like it. But one way to move towards comparing models and also evaluating them is to try to, as Robert Macaulay, who's a philosopher of cognitive science, he says that we should look for interdisciplinary identities. So we have models here, let's say in sociology, we have models here in economics, we have models here in philosophy, and then we have a bunch of models in neuroscience. And then we try to look at those models, whether we can bridge the distance, not by saying that they explain the same thing, but the thing that's appearing here in one model is the same thing. There's an identity relationship between some of the things in one model and another. And then we try to map those models onto each other, or something like that. But this is a difficult question to answer here. But it's a really good question, and I didn't make much. I wasn't able to say much. I wasn't able to say very meaningful things as an answer to that. Sorry, but that's a good question. I need to think about it more.
Thank you, Aku. Gudehard, do you have a follow-up on this answer?
Yeah, I think I would probably answer my own questions in a similar way, that the contradiction between like the Libet experiment and the folk view is probably only an apparent one. It seems to be a contradiction, but if you look more closely, you see that they're talking about different things. Because, for example, the free decision according to the folk view is probably more to partake in the experiment for reasons, and not so much feeling an urge to lift your finger or to move your wrist. So maybe they're talking past each other, and the contradiction is only it seems to be a contradiction, but it is not truly one. That's one possible way. But still, the question remains: what about the pluralism if genuine contradictions remain? And it seems to be that your answer is, if that's the case, the pluralism cannot tolerate in the long run contradictions. It has to be there has to be a resolution to those, and otherwise there's something deeply wrong in our understanding. So that's all I wanted to say. And then, of course, Robert now.
Thank you. Robert, please. Your microphone is off.
Okay. Godehard, I really appreciated your questions. I was genuinely excited when I read them, and it triggered many thoughts. I'll divide my comments and try to make it brief in two categories. One is addressing pluralism, and then addressing consciousness as foundationalism, which I take as a critique and a legitimate one. On pluralism, I would take a step back and distinguish three categories, not two categories, of pluralism. One is explanatory pluralism, which Aku has articulated very well. A second is, no particular order, is epistemic pluralism, in which is what I have used in articulating this landscape of consciousness. And then I would add a third, which may help with the contradiction, which is an ontological pluralism. So I'll start with the third, the ontological pluralism, and I would say I reject that there is no ontological pluralism, that at some point and it may be inaccessible to human beings in a physical life, and if there's one afterwards, I'm not sure we'll know it then either, but who knows. But at some point there is an ultimate truth. There is no, I do not believe in ontological pluralism. So that stated, there is no, my view, there is no ontological pluralism, just as I don't think there is an infinite regress in in physical reductionism, which some people would accept in the sciences. So if we reject ontological pluralism, we then look at the other two categories, explanatory pluralism, which, as I read Aku, makes sense in that there are different explanatory levels of the same kind of phenomena, that you can explain it at different levels of the scientific or philosophical hierarchy. And we may not be able to articulate those together, but they are not contradictory because of the different levels and how they articulate. Second possibility is certainly there has to be some contradictions with theories of any theories. I mean, if you go through the theories of consciousness, there are many very specific scientific contradictions. They are difficult to discern in some cases. I've made the point, Alex referred to the adversarial collaboration, which spent tens of millions of dollars in many years, and particularly between integrated information theory and global workspace theory. And I've made the point, which didn't make, I think, either group particularly happy, that there is no ontological purchase in whatever the results would have been. So ab initio, the experiment had some deep philosophical problems, and the way I described it, perhaps a little aggressively, is that each of the theories, integrated information theory and global work, each had a particular neuroanatomical prediction, where the integrated information theory had the back of the brain to be very simple as the generative consciousness, the global workspace had the front of the brain. And I made the point, if those two were reversed, if integrated information theory had the front of the brain and global workspace the back of the brain, the fundamental ontology of both theories would not be affected. And so the prediction they were using to justify their ontological position was completely unverifiable no matter what the results were. And that escaped the scientific people doing it. So that's what I'm, so that is a genuine contradiction, but the contradiction there, you really have to understand what it means. So there is no ontological pluralism. There is an ontological answer. We may never know it. Explanatory pluralism deals with, because there are different levels of explanation, that is a legitimate position. If there is contradiction that emerges from that, that has to be resolved at some point. But explanatory pluralism is a good way to look at it. What I've used is epistemic pluralism makes a much weaker claim, and that just says at this time in our understanding of consciousness, where I've applied it, that we should not limit our addressing different theories by any predisposed positioning or way of thinking. I have said that in the landscape of consciousness, I have a larger, what's called an Overton window. I'm not sure everybody knows what that means, but in politics, an Overton window says where a politician can say the most outrageous things, but has to stay below a certain level in order to remain at all credible. I think our present president has enlarged the Overton window in politics, but that's a separate issue, which I won't get into. But what I've said is that I have a larger Overton window in my approach to consciousness. I will allow theories in that are interesting, even though I don't believe it. Anil Seth and Tim Bain had a very perceptive comment when they had their list of theories of consciousness, which was a lot fewer because they were dealing strictly neurobiologically. So they had 22 or something like that. And they made the point that in science, as you get more and more data, you narrow the number of theories and by falsification and get down to ultimately a single theory or a number of one. And easily in physics, less easy in chemistry, and still less easy in biology, obviously. So they said the irony or the strangeness of consciousness is the more data we have, the more theories we have. And there was no other science that seemed to, and I thought that was a very telling remark, and I've emphasized that over and over again. So my comment about epistemic pluralism just says at this time, I'm not willing to close off any way of thinking. And if some people, which is not represented here, except Alex's comment, and Alex knows this better than I do, if people in the world of parapsychology and psi research have contributions to make, I'm not willing to reject that at this point. I'm personally not a believer in that psychedelics or even near-death experiences are veridical, but I could be wrong. But I would, fight to the death to not have that as part of the conversation. So my approach to epistemic pluralism says at this time we should not limit ourselves to ways of thinking, and I see that there are these silos of ways of thinking that people don't even realize they have. Theologians, many of you here, would have an implicit dualistic approach, whether it's hylomorphic or substance dualism or some sort of an element. That is a legitimate position, but it is not the only position. I find myself when I attend various meetings of this kind, I'm always showing the the mainstream of that consciousness, that there are these other equally intelligent and equally strong beliefs in other silos. And I'm always bringing people in that, we all think this, but there's these other groups out there. So I just say in epistemic pluralism, let's just let the 100 flowers or now 400 flowers bloom and see how that works. And it's a process. Second question is on consciousness as foundationalism, and I want to be pretty aggressive on this because I really do believe that. And I wouldn't have used the term foundationalism, but it is foundationalism at another level, at a lower level. That it's not so much, it's not a gatekeeper, that it's not a theory among different theories. In other words, the nature of consciousness doesn't compete with dualism and materialism or idealism. Consciousness is the category in which those competing views exist. So consciousness is the substrate on which those questions exist. And when you deal with the next level, which is theology, if you're going from human mentality in terms of the neuroscience of theology, I mean, if you come from another direction, which we do on Close to Truth all the time, whether or not God exists or questions about God in very scientific, metaphysical, and philosophical senses, that's a whole other way of entering the theological framework in a global philosophy of religion, different religious positions, and that's, I believe, completely legitimate. We're now looking at it particularly from the standpoint of human mentality. And if we're doing it that way, my strong claim is that consciousness is the foundational state that everything else is built upon. Because if you have a materialistic view, which many do, in fact, almost half of the now 400 theories of consciousness are materialistic, and many of them are not. We sometimes use people who are not really thinking about it, confound the word materialism and physicalism, which are similar, not exactly the same, but similar, with reductionism. And nobody's a reductionist, but a lot of people who say they're not reductionists are physicalists, that there is nothing other than the physical world. And there are various claims on how you get a non-reductive physicalism. Non-reductive physicalism is a separate category of consciousness, but even within a materialistic physicalist view, many people would say they're non-reductionist. So I just want to be careful about that. That's why your theory of consciousness, I believe, is a critical assumption to make explicit. And in any discussion of how the brain and how the religion, all of that occurs, it's important to be explicit about what you believe your theory of consciousness is, and then to test if that's not correct, if another theory is correct, then how would that function? I want to give you one specific counterexample to everything I've said. And it's a wonderful example, I believe, and it is most articulated by the philosopher Peter van Inwagen, whose major contribution to Close to Truth, a good friend. We just did a 20-part retrospective of his whole career. Hasn't been published yet. We'll publish it next month or so. And he is a very strong Christian philosopher, as many of you know, but he is also a materialist about the person. So Peter van Inwagen does not believe in any sort of soul or spirit or anything about the person, and yet he is a full, and this is a position that's a legitimate one. Other people, Nancy Murphy and others, have this same position. So it's a Christian materialism, and key to their theology is the resurrection and how that occurs, which they firmly believe in. So my point is that to understand processes, you need to start with theory of consciousness and see what the implications are at each stage in order to evaluate both the neuroscience and the cognitive science of what you're trying to get, which is the relationship between a veridical theology, a real existence of God, or an independent spiritual realm that is part of a grand theology. Most of you are obviously from the Christian tradition, and that's, I completely understand that deeply. We've had a lot of work on analytic theology with the leaders in the field, so understand how all of that works. But once again, it is based on some fundamental assumptions which relate to consciousness. So I'm happy to defend against any attacks.
Robert, thank you very much for your insights, and also we are enjoying your brain art behind you.
So yes,
thank you for that. Great. Godehard, do you have some short reply to Robert at this point?
No, if I would have had to answer my questions, the answer would have been quite similar. So I'm satisfied with the answers, because the answer was very close to my own intuitions. I would also emphasize the centrality of consciousness, but I've taken up so much time, so I would like to pass on to the next questioner.
Okay, thank you, Godehard. Aku, you raise your hand, so briefly a reply.
Thank you. So I'll just put my cards on the table. I'm not exactly sure whether I'm strongly committed to the following claims, but they might help to explicate my position if I just say them out loud. So yes, I also reject a kind of ontological pluralism. I don't think that's really the case. I think the world is as it is, and it's in one way, not in another way. So I agree with that, and I'm also a scientific realist. So I do believe that the point of science is to try to get close to truth, get the models to represent the world as best that they can. But, and here comes the big und, and the big und is that I think human beings are such that we can't really operate with the world and in interaction with the world with just one model. And that's a fact about us humans as cognitively, physically embodied, limited beings. And because of that, because of the fact that we can't really form this kind of supermodel of things, or this super idea where we can put all these models that work in their specific domains, that we can put all them together. So I don't believe that's possible, and that might be because of us, not because of the reality itself. So as a consequence, I think we might be in a situation where we end up with contradicting models from time to time. We might end up having to live with different kinds of models and without knowing how they relate to one another. And of course, for those who want to create a unified picture of the world, this might pose a problem. And this is the reason why I've become recently more, let's say, skeptical towards these broad strokes attempts to say and defend views like physicalism or panpsychism or something like that, because it seems to me that these metaphysical views are extremely strong, and at the same time there are so many different ways of different kinds of models in different contexts. And it seems that we might do violence to these models if we try to force them into one big framework. So this anti-reductionism of mine goes a little bit further than just saying that there might be contradictions and we need to solve them. And that's true. There might be contradictions between models, and we want to try to solve them. But in the end, it might be that we need models that are in contradiction and make different assumptions, and there might be no way around that. So I'm willing to live with that.
Thank you.
So again, that's just my view.
Okay, thank you very much. Lluis, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm really pleased to discover that consciousness comes back to center stage in the study of neurology or the mind and so on, because I belong to a generation that was used to ignore completely the conscious dimension. I mean, eliminationist, Daniel Dennett, and so was the mind currency for many years. For instance, for those who were acquainted or have been acquainted with the cognitive science of religion, like Visala, like Justin Barrett and others, I hope they will not contradict my impression that they were moving from the idea that the conscious processes behind religious beliefs and so on were not relevant, were playing absolutely no interesting role, and that we should rather focus on intuitive process, on the Kahneman ways, the first kind of cognition, so more the fast thinking and so and so they were simply subtracting the conscious element and conscious dimension. So I am quite surprised that it is vindicated by Robert now. And well, I am convinced too that it's a new starter, or something that should be vindicated. But yeah, I am not yet sure how which would be the best approach. Some are trying to come back to phenomenological approaches to conscious processes. That could be a good start, but not sure how strong related with neurological understanding. And so, but and well, theology has its own views on or traditions on conscious processes and so. But again, in theology, we have to make a huge effort to accommodate the new understanding of consciousness, conscious functions, and so on. And it's not easy, but yeah, I celebrate that it's the point, because as I told you, my impression was that until recently, for a cognitive and neurological sense of religion, it was a point that was not taken into account.
Thank you, Lluis. Alex, you raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Oh, yes, yes. Briefly here, going back to competing and conflict and contradiction, just a remark from quantum physics, which is truly amazing, and 100 years later, we're still trying to fathom it. Well, so paradoxes in quantum physics are different than paradoxes that may reveal a hidden harmonization, as was discussed. You know, maybe there isn't really conflict, there's something else, or a stubborn error that we must discover, and then we will know which one wins. In quantum physics, there's a third option, which is that when you have a paradox, you have a greater truth. And the example, the technical name is non-Boolean logic, which works in a mathematical space that's called the Hilbert space. In the Hilbert space is where the wave function lives, its world. And what's intuitive about the Hilbert space is that the operators and or do not behave in a classical way. And this means that you can have contradictions. You can have wave and particle behavior. And the classical habit is which one is really true, right? It's a deep contradiction. It feels unsolvable. And that's what quantum physicists realized. That's a wrong approach. And they discovered that there's this thing, the coincidentia oppositorum. The opposites can coincide in that case. And the solution is not, I say it again, a hidden harmonization. Oh, we discovered that, you know, waves are really particles. No, or an error. It's truly a contradiction that survives. So that's not true for everything, but just to offer that contradictions sometimes are greater truths, and they are really contradictory, and yet they happen. You just need another logic to be able to think through them.
Thank you, Alex. Truly interesting. Gudehard, you raise your hand. And then Robert. We cannot hear you, Goody.
I think that Robert was before me. Yeah, I raised my hand after Robert.
It's okay. I can defer to someone in harm's way.
Oh no, I don't worry. I find it hard that's maybe my somewhat anti-Hegelian spirit. I find it hard to swallow that reality in itself ultimately is contradictory. Maybe that's not even Hegel's claim, but that's a different question. So if we have two competing descriptions like this, I would still be striving for one that unifies them in a encompassing view. I'm not trying to give up too early that there is an ultimate contradiction that we cannot resolve. And this attempt of reconciliation, which we also have in quantum mechanics, in some theories at least, a Bohmian interpretation in a way would be an attempt to overcome the contradiction. Of course, cannot claim, I would agree with Robert, to have the ultimate truth, but they are aiming at it. And I'm very influenced by Alfred North Whitehead, and for him, a metaphysical theory, he compared that to the flight of an airplane. You begin in the realm of experience, and then you take up the flight of speculation, and you try to have an overview from above, and then you land and apply it and see whether it's applicable. And maybe it's not to a certain extent, and then you try another one. So that's a kind of pragmatism I would be arguing for. But I would strongly, with Arco probably, and Robert, I'm not sure, argue that we should attempt in the flight of speculation to have a coherent overview, at least as a goal of metaphysical or philosophical and scientific speculation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Godehard. Just before Robert, it's wonderful to be on this ontological, metaphysical level of reality. But if we could just, with our answers, somehow redirect our attention also to neuroscience of religion and try to showcase how this is related to the field, it will be great for all of us, those who will watch this video on YouTube. So thank you. Please, Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to make the point that it would seem that phenomenology is a way to harmonize some of the differences in that approach. And neurophenomenology, as originally designed by Francisco Varela and then more recently Evan Thompson and others, are, when you read their works, and if you didn't know the end result, you would. It's a very strong critique of reductionism for sure, but it sounds like a very strong critique of materialism and physicalism as you read through the arguments, and they're very strong arguments. But then at the end, they always vigorously emphasize that they do not believe in anything non-physical, that everything is within the physical world, and make that very strong because they know they're going to be accused of that by their scientific colleagues, that they are promoting some sort of a woo-woo spooky world, and they then retreat and say no. And to me, it's a very sharp contrast, because they're very smart people and have very good insights, and they make a very strong point, but then they not just hesitate about going beyond the physical in terms of reality, they affirmatively state that they are, solidly in the materialist, physicalist camp, which to me always looks like a curious defensive move, as opposed to kind of intellectually following the nature of your result. One sort of cute comment that I made to Dan Dennett, who was a very good friend. I said, Dan, your arguments, I've heard all the arguments, and your arguments are some of the best I've heard, and I agree with all of your arguments. I just don't agree with your conclusion. So that was my comment to Dan, and that embeds the same kind of approach to neurophenomenology, that the arguments go to a point, but then they hesitate to look at what seems to be the logical conclusion, that the physical world does not exhaust reality.
Thank you, Robert, for mentioning neurophenomenology. Truly some promising results from that field are coming in. And also, Ivan Thompson and his colleagues have a great book in regards also to what we are discussing, blind spot. So I do recommend to all of you, really great book. Godehard, can you please then address the second two questions to Piotr and to Lluis?
The mic on. So I have two more questions. So on the Thomistic approach, Roszak, does your Thomistic protocol resolve intermodal conflict or preempt it? And what follows for the pluralism defended by the other contributors? So Visala warns against assuming that models at different levels will bottom out in any single framework. But you seem to be doing exactly this. You establish a hierarchy in which Thomistic metaphysics assigns every other discipline its proper scope. Suppose neuroscience demonstrates that unified rational deliberation is a post hoc narrative constructed from competing subpersonal processes. Under your protocol, this finding would be classified as pertaining to material circumstances, leaving your Thomistic claim about the rational soul untouched. But at what point would a neuroscientific finding be permitted to challenge your Thomistic commitment? If the answer is never, then your protocol is not an instrument of interdisciplinary dialogue, but a mechanism of theological insulation, the very insulation that Robert Kuhn wanted to avoid. And to Oviedo, a second question, does your call for theology to set the neuroscientific agenda presuppose a resolution to the problem of pluralism that the other contributors have left open? For theology to formulate questions that can productively guide neuroscientific research, there must be some account of how theological concepts relate to neuroscientific categories. If Visala is right that interdisciplinary models may be incommensurable, theology's ability to pose such questions is severely limited. And if Kuhn is right, theology must first settle a position in the philosophy of mind. If Roszak is right, the questions will be shaped by hylomorphism from the outset, potentially predetermining the kind of answers neuroscientific is even permitted to give. So which model of interdisciplinary relations underwrites your proposal? It doesn't seem to be clear from your text. So those are the two questions.
Thank you. Piotr, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Godehard, for the question. Yeah. I would say that my aim was not to establish a very strong hierarchy that excludes different other models or approaches. Just my intention was to say that what we need is a framework, so order, how to relate different parts in order to respect explanatory levels that arise. And I find very interesting your question about regarding the existence of soul, if somehow neuroscientific findings are able to challenge metaphysical, theological issue. Here, I think I would precise that, in my opinion, here it's not the case of isolation, but it's like to see a bigger image, a bigger perspective, because when we receive some neuroscientific data, here we can reshape some theological approach, and we are dealing with two different levels and different languages or approaches. I don't see that we should find a complete answer or something that will eliminate from other perspective, other discipline, the existence of the main claims, etc. But historically, even we see that some neuroscientific findings are reshaping our approach, for instance, to how the perception of time in a mystical experience is now related in theology, or suicide, and how we approach from the moral theology approach. So there is a challenge, is assumed, but not regarding the main metaphysical question regarding the existence. Like, I think we shouldn't accept that mathematics will prove the existence of love. So we don't expect something that will challenge. So we can describe with mathematics maybe some human attitudes in love, but the same existence of phenomena is not possible from all other disciplines. So maybe this will be a very short answer to your question.
Thank you, Piotr. Godehard, do you have a short reply?
Yeah, the short reply is, how do you get at your metaphysical foundation? In that case, then the hylomorphism. Is this merely conceptual analysis, which is a priori? Then, of course, then no scientific finding can undermine this. But that doesn't even seem to be the spirit of Thomism. So don't you have to acknowledge that future insights in the sciences could undermine your metaphysical model? So if your metaphysical model is informed, is an abstraction from, a generalization from your empirical knowledge, then you somehow have it seems that in your paper you have the priority upside down, because the metaphysical model is taken from whatever source, merely conceptual analysis or given by authority or by tradition, to be settled. That's how it seems to me.
But this is thank you for this another question. Yeah, it's very long discussion on the source of metaphysics, and here also we have to answer first how we understand science as such, and what's the metaphysics in science or of science is, and if this is all can be proved by the consequences or explanatory satisfaction in explaining, or how the prognostic possibility of this approach is established. But I think here, as a Thomist, I would apply more for realistic approach. So perception of reality is gaining more with this metaphysical assumption, matter and form, holomorphics, that is now also very discussed in the philosophy of science, how we understand this, but not in the key of dualism. But this distinction is not a sign of separation between. So we try to do, I think, at least from Thomistic philosophy of science, is to see the unified perspective, but with this clear distinction on different levels. Here, inspiration also from quantum physics is very interesting, and I see this interaction here working well.
Thank you, Piotr. Hans, you raised your hand first. You have a question for Piotr?
Yeah, it sort of, the discussion ties into the question I had prepared for Roszak, which for some reason didn't end up in the drive, but maybe I can add it now to the discussion for to keep it coherent. Like you mentioned, in your summary as well, discussion between the brain as causation of experiences or cognition or the enabler. But there is a middle ground, I would say, neural processes, neurons, brain mechanisms might not cause everything, but they might heavily constrain or shape experience or cognition. Like some experiences are very likely partly such and such because of the way they are embodied in brain matter. And that could sort of challenge some accounts of hylomorphism. These stronger, maybe some old-fashioned, strongly dualist, where all cognitive functions or rational functions are like attributed to like immaterial, disembodied minds out there, which are somehow connected to the brain with the body. So this sort of idea from neuroscience that at least the brain heavily shapes or heavily constrains our cognitive functions, even our rational functions, sort of seems to challenge that. There is at least some embodiment in there. So you would need to rethink your hylomorphism with regards to neuroscientific data in some way. You also mentioned in your summary, like, we don't have strong reasons to look for causation in neuroscientific mechanisms, but there is evidence from lesion studies, like if you tamper with the brain or if it's harms, the cognitive function changes, the rational functions changes, and all this doesn't seem to chime well with some hylomorphic accounts, at least from cognition and experience.
Thank you, Hans. Just I would reply shortly that of course we have to remind about different concept of causality, because we use mainly this efficient causality as the only one, but still, at least in Aristotelian approach, we have another types of causality that are not so present in discussion here, and maybe if we have in mind all these possibilities of causation, the hylomorphic approaches can be seen differently. So here, yeah, but I'm sure about the challenging aspect of some discoveries in neuroscience, but still, I think we shouldn't confuse this explanatory levels that are helping us to describe the whole picture. So yeah, I would stop here.
Okay, thank you. Very hard questions. Oviedo, you will probably continue with hard questions.
Yes, a comment on the good hard comments issues. Yeah, I remember old bad movie from Woody Allen, and yeah, Woody Allen, the film meets some extraterrestrials visiting us, and they say, you know, we are very wise people, we know everything, so you can pose questions to us and we will answer and satisfy your curiosity. And so the first question he poses is, does God exist? And the answer of the extraterrestrial is, no, this is not a question you should pose. You should avoid posing this question. So the problem is that we need to decide which questions we could pose or make to neuroscientists. For instance, I don't think that we could ask them, does the soul exist in the traditional strong way and dualist way? So not sure that would be the right question we theologians could pose to neuroscientists. But there are many other issues as those that I was quoting. So to what extent the architecture of human brain and so allows us to assess the traditional views of human beings as specials being able to self-transcending ourselves and to point to higher dimensions, or to being able to be free, to love freely, and so on and so on. These kind of issues are really interesting, and I have the impression that neuroscientific developments could be helpful. Another question is to what extent, if neuroscientific developments contradict traditional views of humans, so for instance, showing up that we are really not free, that is, we are deeply determined by several factors, to what extent it would mean that we have to change our mind and our theological categories. And that's a different issue. It is a radical issue for a theologian, especially for theologians who are dealing with empirical data. For instance, we are doing a project on how religion in general, especially Christian beliefs and practices, are moderating suicide ideation in adolescents and young people. So we were doing collecting data from a sample of more than 400 students, university students in Spain, and well, the data are quite interesting, but there is a significant difference between those who are more religious and having less suicide ideation than the other ones. But what could happen if the result would be that the data show that among these 400 students, those who are more Catholics, more committed, are those who are nourishing more suicide ideas or suicide intentions. So what to do? To hide the report in the box, or to ignore this and start a different research because there is no don't go away. So something similar could happen, and I mean it's quite risky for theologians to open to empirical research and to assume or to accept that they could inform in a way about our understanding. Obviously, for the former question, for the former issue, we could say perhaps there's something wrong in the way we are teaching about our ideas of values, Christian values, to these young people. But yet, perhaps there's something wrong in the way we approach neuroscientific developments. But nevertheless, is always a little bit risky, I admit.
Lluis, thank you very much for your honest response from theological point of view. Also, as a good host, I would offer you cookies, glucose, and coffee. But given that we are online, I cannot do so. But we must meet sometimes in person, definitely. So given that time is really running up fast, I would kindly ask somehow to narrow down the questions and the answers that are follow-ups. So Alex and Aku, please go ahead. First is Alex.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to make comments to the comments that I've made about other comments. So first, I love this question about what evidence would make you change your mind. And I would ask it to philosophers, but I would also ask it to us scientists, given that we are appearing typically with a flag of we just follow the data and we are following the scientific method, right? And again, my opinion is that the sad truth is that nobody really changes their mind when it comes to deep levels. Of course, you do an experiment, you correct, you look, but when it comes to back to isms, which are beliefs, which is another topic we haven't discussed, right? There is faith in science and there are scientific beliefs. And there's this whole probabilistic framework as to how you would update your beliefs given the evidence. But then we hear that famous phrase, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And what that really means is that the prior probability that something is true is zero. And therefore, really, no amount of data would change your mind. So what changes the mind of scientists? Well, I would say the same that changes the mind of human beings. Oh, sorry, what is that? Yeah, the same, una terraza, una copa de vino, that sounds like home. Yes, what changes the mind of people are traumatic experiences, whether ones you're not looking for, like my near-death experience, or some that you're looking for. And I can here just mention one of the greatest neuroscientists of conscious alive, Christoph Koch, and I believe he's made that public, that he's done some quite specific psychedelics, and it's remarkable that he's gone from hardcore materialist to panpsychism a la IIT, and now maybe to idealism a la Kastrup. I'm not saying all of that is due to entheogens, but what changes the mind of people is an experience, and we academics pretend that arguments will change our minds. I think they don't. And then I want to make another comment, separate topic about, I would invite those of you who are dualists to make dualism great again, as Trump would say. Make it respectable again, because I'm telling you from the sciences, it's like the most laughable position. So I would love to hear people saying, yes, we're dualists and that's why. And I think that's compatible with neuroscience, because back to William James's predictive versus productive brain function, you can think of the brain as a permissive organ. And then all of those claims about causality, which is somewhat said, are reduced, like 4 causes, forget about Aristotle, 4 causes, we only have one, it's effective. And actually the effective cause is necessity and sufficiency, which is a very thin way of speaking about causation, which means I turn off the gene or the neuron and the function disappears. I activate it artificially and the function comes back. And then scientists say necessity and sufficiency equals effective causality, equals explanation, equals understanding. That's not granted. But the Egyptians knew that, and with that I'll finish. The Egyptians have the first neuroscientific papers, what is it called, the Edward Papyrus, I think, and they were describing these strong correlations between a man being hit on the head and then difficulty to walk or think. I would submit to you that what neuroscience have done since then is just to refine that correlation and causality to a great extent, but the real question is whether the brain is permissive. And so the transmissive theory of brain function, I think, allows for hylomorphism and dualism and so on. So I think Chalmers did us a great service and a great disservice, because I describe his hard problem as covering the science, covering the crime scene by asking, how does the brain produces consciousness? Well, that's an ill-posed question, because it assumes the brain produces consciousness. But if the brain permits consciousness, then we have a different subtle conversation about causality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also, to my surprise, most of my medical students are dualists, so dualism seems coming around the corner. So it's Aku, then Robert, but please shortly.
Thank you, Alex. I love to listen to your comments. So much good stuff. So I want to highlight another issue that seems to be going on here, and something that I find quite annoying, which is the kind of theologian's impetus, or this first reaction of the theologian. Sorry, there's something wrong with my seat here. The theologian's first reaction always is to somehow cover their bases and try to set the boundaries of the dialogue, or set the boundaries of the discussion, so that his or her retreat back to metaphysics is not stopped. So, and this oftentimes annoys me. So I used to do this all the time myself. So I would say things like, well, empirical results can only produce this and that, and the kind of question that we're dealing here now is a metaphysical one. So you have to play a completely different game. And I don't like that anymore. That's not a sufficient answer to this problem. So we can't really just go on and specify some sort of metaphysical background assumption, then hold on to that and then say that, well, here are these neuroscientific results and we can apply them, of course, but inside certain kinds of boundaries. As if it's not the case that, for instance, traditional arguments for the existence of the soul have basically invoked a missing explanation for what happens in abstract thought, for instance. This is a very traditional argument. Theologians used to say, and philosophers used to say, well, because we can't explain abstract reasoning, it can't happen in a physical system. But now we know how it can happen in a physical system. So we already have a good reason from the results and the approach of neuroscience to reject at least one reason for dualism. And then this is I think this is a bigger issue. So this retreat to metaphysics sounds good on the first go, because you can keep something to yourself. But the problem is that these issues of consciousness, that the free will stuff that I've been working on, people make this move, but then when they end up creating their own concept, like there's a metaphysical concept of free will. Well, who gives a shit about that? The free will that we actually care about is the kind of free will that has to do with our actual psychology. And the same thing with God. It's easy to say, well, there's this theism that we want to defend, and it's a metaphysical view. But who gives a shit about that kind of God? What we need is a God that actually acts and has a relationship with us, and so on and so on. So if we want to defend that, then by defending just a metaphysical view it's not enough. So perhaps I was misunderstood when I was trying to describe my pluralism. The point of the pluralism wasn't that we need to protect the theological domain or the metaphysical domain. That wasn't the point. The point was that we need to put the so-called metaphysical ideas in conversation with the other stuff, so we'll see whether they actually hold up. So
okay,
this is just me airing my grievances here. Sorry. Thanks.
I will need to use beep sound for some of your words. So Robert and Hans Ferdinand, just briefly, please. Thank you. We need to move to Justin.
Okay, a comment on what Alex said about changing beliefs. Over 30 years of interviewing more than 500 people, actually Christoph Koch is the only person that I can talk about who has made a change from being the personification of the neural correlates of consciousness, working under Francis Crick, originating that, to a belief in idealism. Others have had a near-death experience. Alex has talked about that. I want to tell you, I'll do it briefly, that I too have had an experience, but my experience gives me more, puts my sense of dualism and what I've always felt to be non-physical realities required for consciousness, undermines that. So I've had an experience that moved me from being more of a non-physicalist slightly to being more of a physicalist. Now, can you imagine anything that would do that? I can imagine a near-death experience or psychedelics will take you from being a physicalist to more of a non-physicalist, but I've had something that goes the other direction, from being a non-physicalist slightly to a physicalist. So, give you a second to think how that could even be possible, and now I'll tell you the answer. And my daughter, Daniela, has given me full permission to tell this story. So my daughter was in her mid-40s and never got married, lots of boyfriends, and very pretty girl, lots of things, but never got married. She got married when she was about 45 with a younger husband from French. And they wanted to have a baby, and naturally, and she was 45, and she had a pregnancy that was genetically deformed, and they had an abortion. And they tried it again, and the same thing happened. And so the only hope was that she had frozen her eggs when she was 34, about 10 years before. And they were tested. She did it in New York. They were tested, and they found most of them had disintegrated, but there was a couple that were mosaics. They call it mosaics that might be good and may not. Her husband flew to New York, fertilized it in vitro. It took, and a blastula was formed grew to 128 cells. Then it was frozen again. It had been frozen for 10 years as an egg. Now, as a blastula with 128 cells, it was refrozen because she wanted to carry it herself. And for 2 years, her body was prepared with hormones. Her parents, me and my wife, were very unhappy about that because that's a lot of danger for that, but she insisted. And after 2 years, the blastula was unfrozen. It was hand carried from New York to Los Angeles, where she lived. You couldn't send it by Federal Express, so we had to hire somebody to literally hand carry it. In Los Angeles, it was implanted in her after 2 years. 10 years frozen, fertilized, grew. 2 years refrozen, implanted within her. And make a long story short, our grandson is now 6 years old, very social, plays the piano, chess, and ping pong. And to me, with all, my PhD is in biology, and I remain flabbergasted that could occur. There is so much potential built into the physical world. So, I am still a non-physicalist when it comes to consciousness, but just a little bit less.
Thank you, Robert, for sharing your story, family story. And now, Hans Ferdinand, please go ahead.
Yes, Robert, very impressive. Thanks for this very personal and touching story. Sasha, just a question for you. I stepped in like this. Did you intend or did you want us to be in a special row because you asked first Godehard and so, and we are in a row? Or can we just step in as we want? How do you think about the interveners?
We will go by the line. So Godehard, after Godehard, Justin, and then you.
So I wanted to talk about that actually, because I do have to leave at 18:30, I'm afraid. So if I would have to ask my question, it would have to be before that.
Okay, so please go ahead.
That was only a question of how to proceed. I do not want to intervene in the moment.
Okay, thank you, Hans. Ferdinand, then please, Hans van Eyghen, please pose your one question, and then Justin is a good sport and he will go after you. Thank you.
Well, this is about my other question I had prepared, like when I would pose those. That was sort of my point, if I could pose those before 18:30. I don't have a follow-up.
Go ahead, choose one question and pose it now. Thank you.
Okay, sure, I don't want to cut the discussion short, but maybe directed to Aku Visala then, because he sort of rephrased his position, like in a question just before, like on models, like he does advocate some kind of realism. And then my question would be to him, like, when can we, when should we take models from neuroscience into account? And when can we just ascend some skepticism or like have some leeway? It could be like this, but we can also like sort of park it and not put our dice in that basket. Like when does something become so well established, so well supported by evidence that we cannot really ignore it as theologians or as philosophers of religion? Like when would that point arise, according to you? I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Aku, please go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think all disciplines have some sort of an idea when a finding becomes established. But it takes time in different disciplines, and we should we should examine established results very carefully. The other question is whether those established results end up answering the kinds of questions that we're asking as perhaps philosophers or theologians or whatever. Because it seems to me that oftentimes those established results don't really answer those questions. So we need to look into that. But my friend Justin Barrett taught me that in psychology, you should never trust the first set of results or the first or even the second set of studies. That wait for 5 or 4 years to see whether new studies will come in and corroborate the results. And whenever you'll see popular science articles saying that now we've shown this and that, and then there's one set of studies, like 5 studies or something like that, don't take that very seriously. So I guess when you have established results, you can discuss with those and you can look at what they do and so on. But we have to remember that even established results turn out to be sometimes unreliable, but at least we'll know that they're unreliable perhaps later on. But I can't give any more specific answer to that. Sorry.
Thank you, Aku. Maybe just a short piggyback on great Hans' question to Jordan. Is there some kind of scientific study of religion for which you could say, listen, theologians, listen, scholars of religion, this is something really important. This is something you need to take into account. What kind of study do you imagine could be as such? We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, good. So one of the things that pops up in some of our research has to do with the idea of theory of mind and its importance for understanding how people think about God. And let me say one thing. I have no question that God exists in the brain. So it's a very safe space to study religion and God rather than the world, rather than consciousness, etc. I think when we approach our studies, we want to be certain that as much as possible, obviously replication is important too, let me say that, but that's true for any endeavor. You got to replicate. And so there's nothing unique about cognitive science or cognitive psychology in that regard. Replication is important. Okay, so here's an example of something that seems to be important for our research is theory of mind and the relevance of theory of mind, for example, interpreting God's intentions, or the relevance of theory of mind, for example, in distinguishing between what you might consider magical ideation or a miracle. A miracle seems to require a theory of mind. And while we're interested, we like associations when we do our functional neuroimaging studies. I am much more indebted to our lesion mapping studies because they do seem to have some elements of causality. If you have a lesion in one place and it's reliable and it changes people's behaviors, you can feel at least some confidence that it's modulating that behavior in different, could be in different directions as well. So, I mean, so I think we pretty much, as far as I can tell anyway from our research, when we want to understand as humans the idea of God and how God acts in the world, if you have that belief, then we probably utilize our interpretation of others, that is humans, and our prediction about their behaviors. And then we generalize or specify in the case of God. I feel very confident about those results so far, and we've seen them in different studies. So that's an example. I think there are other examples. My own view is that we re-represent the world in our brains. That's the goal of our brain, is to re-represent the world. And the interactions among the networks in the brain allow us variation. And so that enables us to create and to do and to reason and to do all sorts of other things. And it turns out, at least in our studies, when we are studying beliefs, we often see, in the case of correlational analyses, activation of the prefrontal cortex. And if we look at causality, if we have damage to the prefrontal cortex, it alters our beliefs in some very specific ways. So why the prefrontal cortex? Well, it's one of the most evolved areas of the human brain, and it's also a large area. And we also see differences between, I'm going on a little bit, but I was quiet for a while, so forgive me. We also see differences between dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and more medial prefrontal cortex. And just to give you an example, in the case of mysticism, we see that if you have damage to areas within the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and therefore what might be called executive functions, you're more likely to have a strong belief in mysticism. If you don't have that damage, you're much more likely to downregulate and therefore have more scientific or rational explanations for mystical experiences. So there's some consistencies here, and I think one of our goals is to identify, is there anything really unique about the re-representation of religious belief in the brain, or do they simply co-opt already existing networks for other aspects of behavior? I think the discussion about consciousness, while it's interesting, is not unique to understanding religious belief in the brain. It's a broader question. So in our own research, for the moment, we stay away from it. And in terms of interactions, and I think I can speak not just for me, but for my collaborators, I interact with ministers. I have a weekly meeting with a minister every week to throw out what we're finding, to get feedback on it. So I think you have to engage theologians when you're doing neuroscience, as well as sociologists and psychologists, in order to constrain your ideas and help better explain the results of your experiments. So I don't think the study of religion is no different than the study of how we process stories, is no different than other aspects of human behavior. So.
Thank you, Jordan. That was really fascinating. Hans, please go ahead.
Yeah, just to quick reply to Jordan, like if theory of mind is this important to our thinking about God and miracles, like are we doomed to anthropomorphize God, like to think of God in human terms? That was something that came to mind. But I put my hand up earlier. One thing I think theologians cannot ignore and philosophers of religion is studies on out-of-body experiences. Like there is good evidence, according to me, that these have some body elements still in them, that the brain is still modulating these experiences, so they're not fully out of body. So something is going wrong in those experiences if you claim that you're fully detached from your body. It doesn't really seem to be the case. We should rethink those experiences, I think, from a religious perspective.
Okay, thank you, Hans. And I believe we are now ready to move to our third intervener, Justin. So please, when you are ready, go ahead with first shot.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. So Aku raises, I'm going to start with what was my second question in the pre-circulated because I think it fits here. I think Aku raises a really important question that a critical component of doing this sort of scientific study of religion, whether it's neuropsychological or neuroscientific, cognitive, whichever. Whenever you're doing scientific study of religion, you need precise operationalization. And that's a tricky thing. But to amplify Aku's point, it's my view that psychologists and neuroscientists often use measurements that have very poor construct validity. That is, the thing they claim to be studying through their operationalization doesn't really map on to the construct that then they're drawing inferences and implications about. And that the folks who, I think to their credit, the theologians, religious studies scholars, and others want to draw implications from those scientific findings, they will often then take at face value what the scientists claim that they have studied when they actually haven't studied that construct very closely at all. So and the jargon is they have poor validity. What has been operationalized doesn't have that strong relationship to what they are purporting to study. And so then the result can be that they draw these sort of confused or imprecise kinds of implications from the phenomena or construct that hasn't really been studied. I think that's a relatively well-known problem. I know Lluis has brought this one up in various settings as well over the years. But I haven't often seen that philosophers, theologians, or religious studies scholars are necessarily very adept at helping create studies with good construct validity. That is, their contributions don't necessarily help the problem very much. And get those better operationalizations. So I guess this is to say, while I'm really sympathetic to theologians and philosophers contributing in this space, I haven't seen too many success stories. And so my question for everybody is, please buoy my confidence by sharing with us what are those moments, those of interdisciplinary sort of collaboration where you've seen it work really well, where you've seen these success stories that maybe then those can be used as models for replicating good interdisciplinary kinds of cultivation of research programs. Is that clear enough?
I believe so. Aku was the first one. Other theologians, please join after. Go ahead, Aku.
Yes, thank you. That's a great point, and I can't say that I've seen many of those success stories, but what I've seen is things that are more or less successful. And usually, the more success you have, that depends on how well the question is formed. And if the question that the theologians and neuroscientists, for instance, are trying to solve together, the better it's focused and it has a place in some existing discipline or some existing field, that actually helps. I was a part of a big project in Princeton for a year where the focus was on human nature. And all the theologians and philosophers, they wanted to say that we need to start debating the metaphysics of human nature first, before we can go into the scientific details. But this led us nowhere. This was a useless way of approaching it, because there could be no agreement about those kinds of things. The way that we moved forward was that when we focused on a specific question, or a very specific question, like if we find some set of bones in graves and we find a pit that seems to have fire in it, and we know when those bones were there, what can we infer from that? When we have a question like that, then everyone can chime in, everyone can contribute. So if we have those kinds of practical questions, or let's say, well, here are some individuals who experience these weird things when they have some psychedelics, and here are some monks who meditate and have these kinds of experiences. Are there any meaningful differences in the brain in these cases, for instance? That seems like a tractable question, and that seems like a question that no metaphysics clearly can give an answer to. And it has some clearly something that a neuroscientist could say something about. So I think the success is based on formulating the right kind of questions and having those questions such that they are open enough for all sorts of points of view, but at the same time they have to be concrete enough, and there have to be some kind of established steps that we can take to move towards answering those questions. Again, my 2 cents.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Aku. Something like Piotr mentioned, we need a protocol, theological protocol. So, Lluis, please go ahead.
Thank you, Justin. Nice to meet you again, Evan, in this format. Yeah, and thank you for the provocation. I have felt always an outsider, a strange element in the meetings of the Society for Cognitive and Evolutionary Science of Religion. I was attending the last one taking place in Oxford years ago, and yeah, I felt that quite uncomfortably in my approach of trying to relate to my colleagues in this science. But I was having a couple of experiences, one very positive, the other very negative. The positive was when the last presentation by Robert Ross was showing that almost all the methodology and evidence on the theories that was relating religion and prosocial behavior was deeply flawed. And he demonstrated that all the studies by Northern Zion and so we could not rely on all this body of research, because it was suboptimal, to say the least, in terms of scientific standards. So it was my impression that it was science at its best. So science applied to the study of religion that could recognize that what was wrong did. But at the same time, after this collaborator of Miguel Farias organized a second program of cognitive and evolutionary science of religion, and a lady, I don't remember her name, was stating that religious beliefs were just imaginations or imaginary compositions that were having no cognitive content, was her expression. So at the questions time, I asked her whether, in her opinion, Richard Swinburne, that was close to us here in Oxford, all the life being devoted to showing the cognitive content of religious ideas, religious belief, whether he was wasting all his life, all his time, being one of the most famous and acclaimed experts in philosophy of religion. So she was feeling embarrassed and so on, trying to say, well, perhaps for some people it's more than that. And so, but again, I was having the feeling that there is still a long distance between those who are trying to study religion from a scientific perspective and theologians. So it has nourished this mistrust between both sectors. Not sure you know that we are publishing this series in Springer, New Approaches to the Scientific Study of Religion. Actually, the one that was shown by Sasa, I have here in my table too, is the number 21. We are in the number 23, and our attempt is just to show that we can study religion in applying scientific methodology or inside scientific frameworks without necessarily being reductionist or without explaining away religion. But I mean, it's still quite hard and quite difficult to find out connections and better understanding or better collaboration, or to assume by our colleagues and you know them better than me in the new scientific study of religion, to assume that theologians could give some significant input to better deal with this, or at least we could better assist them to design their scales, their instruments, and design their research and so on. That being a theologian in the team could contribute positively to better design the research when you are trying to study religion.
Thank you, Lluis. Like in neurophenomenology. Hans, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the problems why collaborations don't always work, like theologians and philosophers tend to add complexity to issues. And I think there are multiple ways to look at it. There are a large historical background, everything. And of course, empirical scientists don't like that. They want something useful they can measure. And adding complexity, then you end up with a scale of 100 items. It just doesn't work. But to some success stories in response to Justin Barrett, like 3 came on the top of my head. Like one is research conducted by you, theological incorrectness, seems to be like shared by theologians and philosophers of religion, at least to some extent. Also, like the mysticism scale was based on work by Walter Stace, who was rooted in like historical analysis of mystics, which seems it's been criticized, at least to have attracted some elements of mystical experiences quite well. And then a more recent one, there's a project conducted by Ryan Byerly, along with cognitive scientists, funded by Templeton Foundation as well. I think they are doing solid work there as well.
Thank you, Hans. Jordan, when you write project proposals, do you include theologians in your project team?
I tried to reach out to theologians locally, right? And I can't say I've had much success there. So I tend to reach out to ministers, to lay people who have religious beliefs or practice. And the reason is that, what I'm studying is what's in my participants' minds, not some esoteric ideas about religion. And so we want to make sure that when we talk to them, we're probing them in the right way for their validation or their answers, however we try to inspire them to answer. So I'm actually happier with dealing right now anyway, with dealing with ministers, people on the ground, so to speak, rather than theory. And that seems to work reasonably well for our studies. I must say that in the United States, when you get participants or volunteers, unless you really go out and ask, you're likely to get an overwhelming majority of Christians, for example, in volunteering for your studies if they have beliefs. But that's okay. I don't think we have to get into cross-cultural issues because my guess is that the neural architecture for representing beliefs is going to be similar in location, in geography anyway, no matter where you are, if you have equivalent beliefs. And so I'm not concerned too much about that. I must say, the challenge is not simply getting good collaborators who are engaged in religious practice of various kinds. The bigger challenge is getting funding. Now, aside from the Templeton Foundation and maybe a few other places, I remember bringing this up to some people in extramural at NIH, And it was like a deer looking at headlights. They had no idea why I wanted to study religious belief. And there are biases still, as we put in our opinion piece in Nature. There are clearly biases against funding such research for lots of reasons. So no, I haven't had the opportunity to work closely with theologians, but we try to utilize either scales that seem acceptable and were developed with the aid of theologians or ministers, for example, or psychologists steeped in religious studies. So we try to do that as much as possible, or we do surveys. We take surveys from, say, the Baylor Institute of Religion, and we try to scale them down so we have the dimensions that are best represented in the survey. So we try to do those things. And now, because I mentioned this before, we want to look at transitions in belief. And to do that, you have to talk to people extensively. You have to, what are they going through? What's in their minds? Why are they transitioning? What experience did they have? And that, I believe, is quite important to getting a handle on how you study that phenomenon.
Jordan, thank you very much. Time is slipping away. Alex had to go, Hans soon. So I know that Aku won't mind if I ask Justin to pose the second question briefly, and then Hans Ferdinand as the last intervener. So Justin, please, a brief question.
Sure. Yeah, let's go in a different direction. A few of you apparently have expertise and mentioned your interest in non-physicalist kinds of anthropologies. So I have in mind here various versions of idealisms and panpsychism, maybe even in their Christian varieties. These seem to be cropping up more and more. If we take the idea of mental states, mind and or consciousness as the basic stuff of the universe, instead of taking material stuff as fundamental, how would that change how we think about neuroscience of religion or neuroscience and theology? Do you see any sorts of potential neuroscientific studies as able to bear upon any of these metaphysical frameworks? That is, to make some more plausible than others in light of the evidence. And so, I mean, you sort of see where I'm going with this, because I find some of these ideas very interesting, but how would I know? How would I know I'm on the right path? And it sounds like a few of you have ideas along these lines, and I would love to be educated.
Thank you, Justin. So Hans, go ahead.
I do have ideas on this, like direct implications on these metaphysical theories from neuroscience. There won't be many, but if you ask me, some evidence for strong neuroplasticity, that functions of the brain can migrate or that their brain functions can change drastically, seems to be some kind of evidence that the brain or the material brain is not in the driver's seat. That ideas may be able to alter materiality, and therefore there might be something beyond matter or physicality out there. That's my 2 cents.
Robert, please.
Yeah, I would disagree with that. I think that when we have a distinction between the physical and the non-physical, the basic fundamental principle of science becomes undermined. And that science as an enterprise, once you're going into the non-physical, loses its power that it had in the physical. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we have to be very, very, very careful about making that distinction, because science operates wonderfully in the physical world, and when you get into the non-physical world, it's a totally different methodological idea. I mean, assuming there is a non-physical world, I would be chary very much about trying to build scientific verifications or falsifications or replications of things that have non-physical components to them. I think at the end of the day that everything we are talking about is so interesting and fascinating. Jordan's work in particular, in terms of what parts of the brain would be affected with mysticism, or, you know, if we can go further in understanding the nature of how people feel about grace or sin. there will be neuroanatomical locations potentially. Maybe it's, I would think that it is a generalization of some other principles that have evolved from evolution, but is there anything specific that is religious in there? These are potential areas. But at the end of the day, you will have two views on this. One is it's a complete explanation of religion, and that's what the scientific materialists would think. And you don't need God, you don't need anything veridical behind it, because you just have that expression. And others would say, obviously it should be there if there is a God, and God wants you to experience a mystical experience or grace, so that you have to have a brain part to do it. So God would have engineered evolution in some way to make that happen. And you will never, ever get out of that paradox, ever. I have an analogy to make, which came from Closer to Truth over the years, and it had to do with the universe being verdant for life, and the proliferation of intelligent creatures in the universe. And no matter what the result would be, I mean, take two extreme results. One is the universe is teeming with life, and the other is that human life and life on Earth is absolutely unique. Just to take the two extremes. Theists and atheists can explain each one from their own mental perspective, from their own assumptions. So to take one, if there is, the universe is teeming with life, the theist would say, see, God designed a universe that is full of life. And the atheist would say, see, the universe is full of life, humans are not so special. You know, and the crucifixion story and everything is irrelevant, because the universe is teeming with life. On the other hand, if there's only life on Earth, the atheist would say, see, the universe is just completely oblivious to life. It has no meaning. It's only here on Earth. And so it's a complete accident. And the theist would say, no, God made it a special effort, and therefore humans are unique. So no matter what the results are, each will interpret it in their own way, and that will never change. That will never change. However, there is still progress to be made in terms of understanding more about the brain and how it functions in these capacities. And each side will interpret it in their own way and never think that you can change it.
Thank you, Robert. That reminded me of the story from Andrew Newberg when he published the first survey with nuns. And on the same day, he got a call from atheistic community and from the monastery. Both of them congratulated him on his results and proving that God does not exist, that is, that God exists. So thank you for that. Godehard,
I'm
please.
afraid I have to leave. Great discussion.
Thank you, Hans.
We're interested to receive the rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Godehard, please go ahead.
Yeah, Justin, this is about your question as someone who has been advocating panpsychism in one way or another. The hope that we will decide scientifically or by empirical method which metaphysical theory is best is somewhat, maybe not entirely, but somewhat unfounded, because I would argue that a good philosophical theory should always be consistent with the best science we have. So if you argue for whatever, if let's say you are a dualist or an idealist, and your dualism or idealism is at odds with our current science, then it's not a good version of idealism or dualism. So in that respect, the philosophical theories should always be consistent with our best science. And this means there is no scientific direct proof that shows that panpsychism is better than another philosophical metaphysical theory about the mind of consciousness. But there might be other advantages. For example, if you are a theist, the idea how God could be immanent to the world and could somehow influence the world, that's what Aku said. If God doesn't somehow influence the world, what good is God? That's more easily accommodated if the intrinsic nature of matter is mental, because God not being a physical power and God not interacting physically with the world might be able to interact mental to mental with the world. And if the intrinsic nature of matter is mind, then you have a more consistent, more coherent idea of how God could be immanent to the world. So the philosophical theory might help you to integrate science, the scientific worldview, and the religious worldview, but there's no way to directly decide which philosophical theory is better by merely scientific experiments. Because if you can disprove a philosophical theory by scientific experiments, it was a bad theory to begin with.
I think my question wasn't as precise as it should have been. And so let me try to clarify just a little bit. I was not asking what kind of evidence would prove panpsychism, for instance. That doesn't seem right. But it does seem to me, at least I'm curious what the view is on whether, how would you approach the scientific study differently from a panpsychic perspective, for instance? How would that frame the kinds of questions that you would ask differently? Or would it make a difference at all? Or take whatever non-physicalist kind of metaphysics or theological anthropology. Partly I'm interested in some of the earlier papers' claims that theology can provide some guidance to the particular kinds of questions and can give shape to the kinds of models that the scientists are doing. And if it ends up looking like whether you're a panpsychist or a Berkeleyan idealist or a non-reductive physicalist, doesn't matter at all for doing how you do neuroscience, I would just be surprised. Maybe that's the case, but it sure feels like it should make some kind of difference, at least in the sorts of questions that you're generating, the sorts of problems that you're interested in exploring. So I'm more interested in that side of things, not in the, oh, well, let's let science show that panpsychism is correct. I don't assume that that would be the case. I assume that, but then you said something, Goodhart, at the very beginning that I found interesting. You think that these metaphysics should not be at odds with the latest science, but that suggests that there are empirically tractable components of the metaphysical systems that are being proposed. So maybe there's an opening there.
I do apologize, but we have some maybe 20 minutes more, and we moved away from the concept of neuroscience of religion, and we still have Hans Ferdinand. So perhaps in transcription of whole of this talk, we can continue the discussion on panpsychism and science. So please do forgive me for this. Hans Ferdinand, please go ahead and ask your questions and give us back to neuroscience of religion. Thank you.
Yeah, first, it's fascinating to be in this group. And after the talk now, I think all the questions I had are a small part of that, what I want to ask right now. And what for me was interesting, let's say the two worlds which came together. I want to start with a short story just to make clear where my question comes from. Together with a biologist, I trained students coming from the days, a presentation about evolution from biological and from theological view. And after 3 days, theologians still discussed what is evolution and so on. And after half an hour, after 2 hours, the biologists were ready. So I think that's a little bit what happens here, different approaches. And afterwards, we started to see that we did not understand what was the meaning of this, because theologians discussed the meaning. And for me, the question here, and at first it will go to Jordan. It's nice to meet you here again after a long time. My first question is regarding meaning. Jordan, you told that you are sure about this, and I'm sure about this as well. Can you imagine that also the devil is in the brain? Do your research go to
might be God
like
in our
to go,
project.
yeah,
Yeah,
I was going to say
in our research
to the devil
project.
and sin.
Yeah, just to add, in our research project, we have a Japanese, and we talked about once, and he told me, "Oh yes, how many gods do you want that I talk about?" So when you see God in the brain, there might be some concept of God that you find in the brain, or do you just see correlates or substrates regardless of what meaning of God is represented? So that's my first question to you, and especially I'm very happy to see you here after about 10 years.
Yeah, right. So one of the problems that I feel we face in understanding this has to do with who we study. So by and large, we have studied amateurs, that is, people who have some form of religious belief of different depths. And to give you a counter example of something we've done in the past, we were interested in studying planning in chess. So rather than just study average chess players, we studied players who had high ratings. In other words, they were chess experts. And I think that's one of the issues with how we do our studies in terms of how we formulate what we are studying. So would our studies be much different if I was studying, for example, theologians versus practicing theologians and asking them specific questions versus the average person? And we tend to study the average person. And so all our findings and what we can claim is based on that. So it's a limited sample. It's not a sample that we can say applies to anybody else. In terms of multiple gods or other aspects of religion, anything that is represented in the brain, we can potentially study. And my presumption is all experience that people have, either in some depth or not, is represented in the brain. It's very Bayesian in terms of how we think about how people activate or even implicitly utilize such representations. I just don't think there's a problem in the brain of studying any of this. There's just no problem. But I think the problem is replicating, making sure your subject samples across studies are similar, et cetera, that the tasks or questionnaires or scales are similar as possible. And then you can feel more confident about replication. It's not about the world out there. That I think that's a distinguishing feature. I think we're looking at individuals for the most part, or how individuals are primed by other individuals to have belief systems, but it's in the brain or in the gut. These days, the gut is very popular in terms of research, but and does influence brain processing. So I think you have to keep a very open mind, as I know you have, Hans. And I think when you go into this, you can't be afraid of what you're going to find. I don't know. You know, I've been on Catholic radio here in the state. It's very accepted, the kind of research we do. Even nobody thinks we're trying to contradict religious beliefs at all. We're just trying to better understand how they function in the brain. And if you study, of course, health outcomes, there's an interesting area which we have not brought up here, and that is depending on the depth of your beliefs, you can more or less interpret a health outcome as being consistent with a religious belief, a prayer, for example, helping a health outcome versus not. There are many areas here to study and to better understand, and we are just the tip of the iceberg, really, in understanding this. But I think it's a worthy approach if you believe the brain is important.
Thank you, Jordan. Lovely. Thank you, Jordan. Also, just to mention, Lluis and Piotr are really developing a network that studies relationship between religion and health and well-being. So just good to know and connect. Hans Ferdinand, please, your final question.
Yeah, my central question, and I heard quite often the term religious in this discussion. I did not count it, but I think it was about 20 or 30 or 40 times. For me, it's when I started as young researcher, my problem was what is religious? And what's the religious beliefs? And maybe, of course, it's not so seen from a brain, not so different from economic or other beliefs. But what's a religious belief? And I had bad experiences with persons who claimed to have religious beliefs, which were very misanthrope, very hateful, very whatever. And and they call it a religious belief. So what's the question I would bring in this discussion? Is it possible not to focus on religions, but on the way how persons access religions? More or less to ignore for a moment the content of religions, but to access the way how persons individually access this what religions present, and that the different religions present different things. So something is overlapping, something not. Is this a way to bridge the question of neuroscience, science, and religions to focus on the way how people access? Or do we need really to step into religion and into all these metaphysical discussions and all these terms we had here in our discussion? Or is it sufficient for the moment as starting point to address the question of how they access religion, how they access components of religions? That's maybe a question to Jordan, but also to Aku, to Robert. Gorihat, you are intervener, but I think you are a specialist in this field as well. So a question to all of you. And for me, it's maybe the bridge how I can feel adapted to that what we are doing here, Sasha, which is a great thing.
Thank you, Hans Ferdinand. Also, Justin was nodding his head, so maybe he has a comment also. So, Aku, Justin.
Yes, sorry, Justin,
ahead.
Of course. Yeah.
Shortly, please.
So, I guess I'm going to say the kinds of things that Justin is going to say. I think our thoughts are probably in line with this. So, this concept of religion, you can use it in all sorts of different ways, and I don't really care about that too much. So what constitutes a religion in some general sense? Not very interesting. What is interesting, how people think about, let's say, dead relatives. That's interesting because that's a question that you can work with. Or how people react when certain weird things happen in their neighborhood or something like that. That's something that you can actually study. So in that sense, I find it quite confusing to say things like, well, here's a religion and we study religion. So religion from this point of view is a kind of heuristic term. So let's take something that people happen to call religious and let's just go along and study that and see what comes up. So in that sense, I don't care too much about what people call religion or what we define religion as some sort of a whole thing or a system or something like that. So I would then use this. That's just a starting point for studying things. And later on, we can learn that, okay, well, there are all sorts of things going on in the mind and in human beings and in social psychology and in all these other fields, which actually have to do a lot with the kinds of things that happen in the domain of what we call the religious. Or we study experiences that people have. We tend to call those experiences religious experiences. Say a guy, sees the Virgin Mary, or another person is abducted by UFO. Instead of saying, well, let's study, the other is a religious experience and the other is something else. Well, that's not really a useful question to ask. The useful question to ask is, well, what kind of brain mechanisms or psychological features have to do with these experiences that we can study, and only then we can talk about the differences or the similarities between those, instead of saying that there's such a thing as religious this and non-religious that. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Aku. Perhaps that was the motivation behind the building block approach in these disciplines. Justin, please, then Godehard.
Sure, real fast. A positive example that maybe actually connects on a few of these comments. Recently, a very large research project was led by Dean Zimmerman, philosopher at Rutgers, and Tanya Luhrmann, anthropologist who studies lots of experiences at Stanford. But they rounded up with them another religious studies scholar, Ann Taves, two perception scientists, one who studies audition, one who studies vision. And what they were studying was non-ordinary experiences. And they just left it vague whether these are called religion or not, because to Aku's point, that wasn't the thing that mattered. And what was fascinating about this study, and at least the genius I saw behind it, is they started with certain kinds of philosophical frameworks. It was motivated out of philosophy of religion. And that is the issue of whether it's the case that these certain kinds of non-ordinary experiences count as genuine perception. Because if they count as perception, then they have a different epistemic status if they're not, than if they're not perception. But then, well, are they cases of perception? To answer that question, we need at least sort of three sorts of input. One is philosophy of perception. Second is the science of perception and how those can inform each other. And third, well, what are the phenomena on the ground that people are actually experiencing? What do they actually look like? And you can explore that in lots of phenomenologically, neuroscientifically, there are lots of ways to do that. But then the hope, and I don't know what the results are, have not seen the results yet. This is a new kind of program, but would lead to something like, well, what if it turns out that some of these are genuine cases of what at least philosophers would typically take to be experience for philosophical grounds and maybe for neuroscientific grounds? Well, if they actually are perception, then the people who have these experiences maybe are entitled to whatever the cognitive or epistemic deliverances of those experiences are. And now it says something about what your stance ought to be about the reality of these in the world. So it's a nice example, I think, of trying to be very specific, not getting too hung up on whether it's religious or not, but bring the right kinds of experts together to formulate questions in the right way and gather the right kind of evidence that you've got an emergent picture that's a little bit bigger. And doesn't only say things about what's happening inside your head, but maybe because of what's happening inside your head, what you ought to believe about the world outside your head.
Thank you, Justin. Godehard, then Ulrike.
Yes, I would strongly argue not to use the term religion or religious in this context, because it's simply too vague. To make things even worse, there are entire traditions, for example, in Christianity, to argue that Christianity is not a religion. What Justin said, I think, is exactly the right direction. You have to specify it. Religious experience, for example, makes it much more easier to handle, or certain religious practices can be scientifically studied. The question, what is a religious experience, can be studied. So it has to be, since the term religion is too vague, it has to be much more fine-grained so that you can operationalize it for a scientific study.
Thank you. Ulrike, please.
Yeah, hi. I've been listening to this discussion, and I wonder whether what's missing is perhaps a shared boundary object for interdisciplinary work. I come from a practical, artistic, and systemic background. I work with language and imagery in direct work with people. And so I propose not consciousness as such, but the structure of consciousness as something dynamic, relational, and changeable. Perhaps this could be a boundary object and could be a way to connect more empirical approaches with the metaphysical questions we are circling around here.
Ulrike, thank you very much for your contribution also. Our 3 hours have really passed so fast, and I'm not truly surprised that we end up by asking what is religion and religious and how useful it is, because it seems, as did in Rijeka, that these kind of concepts are still, that we are still struggling with them, and that we need a clearer perspective. I would like to thank all of you for your dedicated time to prepare the concept notes, to prepare the questions, and to be part of 3-hour discussion. And I believe if we had more sugar and coffee, we could continue on for hours on some great place. And I do hope this will come true. So project funds, please be with us. And with this, I would like to end the official part of this meeting and say thank you to all until next time.
Thank you, Sasha, for organizing.